How's everybody doing this morning? Good, excellent. So I'm here to talk about CSS architecture. I stuck around yesterday and watched a bunch of the talks, so I know you guys have probably heard some of this stuff before, and I think at some points I might go on a little bit of a rant. Anyway, I'm going to do a little bit of time travel. I'm going to go back in time, and okay, maybe I went a little too far, but I do sometimes feel like a dinosaur. I've been doing web development for over 20 years now, which is a long time considering that's, pretty close to how old the web is. So, these days I do kind of feel like the old man yells at cloud. I'm just going to yell at random things. All right, let's go back in time, a little bit of time travel, back to 2002, 2003. Yes, mission accomplished. US won the war. And Wired went through a redesign. Now, Wired magazine, when it did this, was one of the first major sites to go with CSS as their layout technique, not using tables. And that was a pretty momentous time. Shortly thereafter, ESPN went through a similar process, and suddenly we had this bargaining chip, right? As web developers, as designers on our teams, could go back to our boss and say, look at these sites, they did it, right? They made their sites more manageable, easier to design and build by using these types of approaches. And I think back to a lot of the community back then. So this is, around 2003, I would say like the height of blogging. It was cool. Twitter wasn't around, Facebook wasn't around. The way we shared things was through our blogs. We'd have little blog rings on the side where we'd link to all our favorite sites, and that's how we got to know all these techniques. Going to sites like A List Apart, where we would share all these fantastic ideas. And I think about a lot of the design work that I did between sort of 2003 and 2009. Even as a freelancer, a lot of my work was relatively straightforward. Like I have a home page, I have an inside page. And a lot of the client work I did was a home page and an inside page. There wasn't really a lot of complexity to that. In fact, it's fun to kind of go back to my code that I wrote and see, like, you know what, my CSS for my website is relatively small. It's about 10K. I mean, can you imagine coming into a project where the CSS is only 10K? Like, not even minimized. This is like completely uncompressed. I can go into my style sheet. It's all one page, and I can edit that stuff. That's it. That would be a wonderful thing, And yet, I look at that code, and I realize some of the weird things that I did on my site. Like, why do I have a selector that is this long? Because the thing is that when we look at a selector, the thing that we actually care about, the HTML element that I want to look a certain way, is that thing on the far right, right? That is the thing that I actually want to style. How many authors did I have on my website that I needed to have this huge, long selector in order to be able to style this thing? And same thing with the comment number. But like I said, my particular site, relatively straightforward. And the thing is when we work on sites like this, it sometimes feels like playing with Jenga. That you kind of start knocking off this piece, and then you're afraid that things might completely fall. This cat's actually pretty good at Jenga. Okay, let's try another cat. Cats and Jenga are kind of my thing right now. And so, the ability to play, to take a piece of CSS out and make sure nothing breaks. And man, these cats are pretty good at Jenga for some reason. So, when you have this thing where you take pieces and you just keep adding it to the top, eventually you get CSS that starts to look like this. This was actually the CSS as it was when I first started at Shopify. This isn't the compile compress. This was the CSS file that I would have to edit every day that I came to work. And that was a single step. We use Sass, right? Sass solves your architectural problems, maybe. And it was this idea that I'm going to work on one page, and then I'm going to take anything that is different on the next page, and I'm going to add it to the bottom. And then I'm going to move on to the next page of my site, and anything that's different, I'm going to add it to the bottom. right? The CSS file almost looks like a cut down tree. You can see the rings of your project as it is evolved from the beginning to the end. Probably the code at the bottom you love, the code at the top you hate. But of course, those kind of projects are really frustrating to deal with because they're complicated to understand. You know, you make changes one place, they break in another. And you know, eventually we just kind of get frustrated until we, damn it, there was supposed to be animation while I was talking. Damn it. Thank you. Okay, we'll continue on. So, you know, in a project like this, there is this strong desire to just blow it all to hell, right? Like, let's just completely demolish it and start from scratch. And some projects we can do that. When I first started at Yahoo, that was a great opportunity, and we ended up redesigning the entire suite of products, and every piece of code that we created was from scratch. I didn't have to worry about like layering my CSS on top of an existing project. But not all projects are like that. I'm sure some of you have probably worked on these things. And when I came into Shopify, we did not just tear everything down. You know, we took a very step-by-step approach in breaking that down. So, breaking things down. When I worked at Yahoo in the process of that, I came up with an approach called SMAX. Again, if you've seen some of the talks yesterday, you've probably seen some people mention this offhand. What is SMAX? So SMAX is a scalable and modular architecture for CSS. The point about this is that it describes how to approach site design and development. So there's no GitHub repo, there's no library, there's no framework, there's no tooling. It is strictly my opinion for about 100 pages. So if you like to hear me talk, maybe you like to read the book. And the thing is that the techniques can actually be applied to pretty much anything, right? Like if you're doing static CSS in a single file, sure. If you're using Sass and breaking things down into individual files, sure. If you're using React, if you're using web components, the premise is still the same. Okay, so let's think about what it means to be modular. Now, a module is a set of standardized parts or independent units that can be used to construct a more complex structure. I took that from the dictionary. I'm quoting the dictionary. I mean, this sounds like Lego, right? Like, oh man, I have all these pieces, I can build stuff. But have you ever gotten like the Destroyer, right? Star Wars Destroyer, emptied everything out of the box, and then like, I'm gonna build something without the manual. Could you imagine trying to do that? That would be insane. So I feel like Lego is a really poor example, but everybody uses it. So I'm not going to go with the Lego example. I'm going to go with the Tetris example. See, Tetris is very modular. You have a set number of pieces. They have different shapes that fit together in very specific ways. And when we're building a modular system, we need to find how do all the different pieces fit together. You know, we want something that we love to work in and love to build. So while Lego may give us that flexibility, we need a little bit more structure and a little bit more control in our projects, right? We want to standardize our system. Okay, so we heard standardize. Independence was the other sort of key piece to building a modular system. The thing is that there is a lot of things that actually get in the way of our ability to create independent systems. CSS, for example, has inheritance. CSS inheritance, very cool. I can specify font family Arial at the body, and pretty much my entire page inherits that. Again, like I think back to my early days of font tags and having to wrap that around pretty much every piece of text that I had on the page. That is not a great way to build websites. So inheritance can be a very useful tool. But it's really hard when we build something and this thing deeper within is picking up these styles that we don't want it to. The Cascade. Again, the Cascade can really throw some wrenches. I'm sure if you guys have dealt with specificity, you may shake your fist at the Cascade and want to get rid of it. But again, the Cascade can be helpful in the stuff that we're doing. We also have browser default styling. If I put a list item on my page and then I create a link, there's going to be a different inherent style that comes with that, and how do I manage or override the styles that the browser is giving me? And lastly, once we've created this independent module, we need these modules to all work together. When I put a button beside an input or inside a modal or inside a header, all of these things, how does that work well together? So there's often within our industry talking about this independence, but there's not a lot of people talking about how do we build a cohesive system that can work well together. So I'm going to touch on inheritance first of all. Inheritance, for the most part, we're dealing with typography. So we're dealing with color, font size, font family. There are some list styles and table styles that are also inherited. For the most part, we don't worry about them too much. Yesterday's React talk, I stole this slide. Thank you very much for the slide. Where we have, we're trying to create, this style where this flyout or this drop down is inside the header, and the text color for that is orange. But you've specified the header text color to be white because of the logo or the menu link and all these things. So how do we kind of stop that inheritance styles from impacting things that we don't want to? And the thing is that inline styles won't save you from inheritance. Right? So this is kind of like my rant against the whole, React solved CSS by inlining styles. You still have the inheritance problem. If I don't actually override that in my particular module, it's still going to be styled with the color of the parent elements. Inheritance works that way. So there are a couple techniques that can solve that. If you saw Phil Walton's talk on web components with its shadow DOM essentially protects styles from impacting that, and likewise styles declared within the web component from impacting anything else. So while we don't have web components today, we are starting to see some things give us those tools, and hopefully by next year we'll have that. Same thing with the all initial property. I'm going to do a quick little demo. So you'll notice I had to do this in Chrome. Safari unfortunately does not support this yet. But let's say we had this really basic module. It's nav, we've got the heading, we've got live. You know what? Damn it. Sorry. Hey, now you can actually see what I'm looking at. So I have a heading. I have a list of items. So this is pretty straightforward. And what the all property does is it allows me to reset the styling for that particular element. So in this case, I said all initial, and as you can see, it overrode pretty much everything. It's no longer sans serif. There's no font size. Any of those things that were inherited are gone. But of course, if we look at can I use, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of support. So hopefully Edge will get it one day. Hopefully Safari will get it one day. And we can do cool stuff with all initial and being able to manage those types of things within our project. Okay, Cascade. So, the Cascade is how the browser decides what properties to apply when you have multiple rules declared on the same item. Now, again, this is sort of a natural part of CSS. We've learned to work with the Cascade. But the thing is that the reason why we run into these problems is because we write multiple rules. How do we solve this problem? Don't write multiple rules for the same element. And that example with the header and the flyout, the thing is that if we think of that in a modular way, it's not one big, huge component. It's actually made up of individual pieces. And what we want to do is really style things at the sort of the lowest level as opposed to the highest level in order to avoid having to say, okay, I'm going to write this rule that applies to everything, and then I'm going to write this rule that applies to the header, and then I'm going to write this rule that applies to the navigation links, and then stuff that applies to the navigation sublinks, right? And this layering of one rule over the other where I now have to worry about the cascade in order for these things to work. Whereas if I break things down and I move the styles down to the lowest level, we avoid those elements affecting other things, and we avoid other things affecting those elements. Now, inline styles in that case actually does, because right, if we're bringing things as close to the component as possible, inline styles is as close as you can get. So in a way, inline styles can solve that problem. And we can also create a structured layering system to prevent conflicts, which is essentially what SMAX tries to do. SMAX says, we're going to build a component, we're going to build a module, and we're going to keep the styles for that in one place. We're not going to take a bunch of components, build a larger complex system, and create a connection of rules between them. We're going to try to keep things independent so that we can combine things more easily. Yeah, browser defaults. Now, let's say we have a button. We're going to give it a class of a button, and we're going to give it some styles. So it's got a border, it's got some padding, it's got a color. Excellent. But of course, on any project with buttons, sometimes we have links that still need to behave like links, but we want them to look like buttons. So we're going to give it a class of button. Now, again, out of the box, you'll suddenly wonder, why does my button have an underline on the text? But that's because the browser by default gives links underlines. So we have to add an extra rule to remove that text decoration, right? So there's a dependency with the CSS that we write and the HTML that we write. Again, two ways that we can solve this. One, we can use all initial when that eventually becomes available to all browsers. And the second is predictable HTML. So if I can predict my HTML, I can write rules knowing that things aren't going to change. So if I'm using a templating system, and again, something like React, if I'm putting my stuff in JSX, my HTML structure is defined. And as a result of that predictable HTML, I know that I can write styles as to what a button should look like or what a list item should look like without styles, sort of the unpredictability of moving styles from one HTML element to another. Now, the fourth thing was putting modules together. Okay, so we have a button, right? Nice and straightforward. It is this isolated thing. And now let's say I want two buttons next to each other. Okay, that's probably not the most prettiest thing, right? We want some margin between the items on our page. And so how do we do that? I mean, there's a bunch of different ways that we can do it. We could just say all buttons have like 10 pixels of margin or one rem or whatever unit you wanted to use. But the thing is that, like if we want them aligned to the left, well, we probably don't want padding or margin on the left side, or if everything's aligned to the right, we probably don't want things on the right side. We just want things between the elements. Okay, well, I've got two buttons together. I'm going to say if a button is next to a button, give it margin left. And sure enough, that does the trick. I've got my two buttons. Fantastic. But then, we have inputs next to buttons. Okay, well, how do we solve that problem? We can just double up on selectors. So we can just say button plus button, and then maybe inputs plus button. What are all the different combinations of one module next to a module, and let me declare what that should look like. But of course, we could also use the lobotomized OWL selector as popularized by Hayden Works. I'm trying to remember what his real name is and not his Twitter handle. Sorry, what was that? Hayden Pickering? Thank you. So there's an article on a list apart talking about the OWL selector. But I find this a little too broad. Like I don't want everything. I just really want specific modules in certain cases to have a certain margin. But even still, we're going to have certain exceptions. Like, I want some buttons when it's next to certain inputs to actually have no margin or padding because it's a special case where it's like this attached view. And then between that and the button, I want spacing. And so like the owl selector or all my sibling selectors go out and I have to add more selectors to all these sort of exceptions. And that's kind of a tricky problem to solve. There are different ways that we can solve that. Of course, I kind of feel like doing this. So 2 ways that I find are best for this. One is we can actually separate layout from module. Again, a really good example from Phil Walton's presentation yesterday was talking about creating like a web component for layout. So let's say a grid system that you essentially wrap the web component around all your individual HTML elements that you have, and then the web component builds a more complex HTML structure to place the required elements in order to create the flex grid or whatever it is that you need in order to create the look and feel that you want. And again, this allows your modules to be isolated specifically, like there are no dependencies on anything else, and then we just wrap those with layout elements to say, okay, well when I have these 2 layout elements next together, they're going to create a certain amount of padding. So the other way we can look at it is we can use what I call micro layout classes. If you're familiar with Atomic CSS, not to be confused with Atomic Design, or Tachyon, or a couple other frameworks out there, they essentially have individual classes that do one thing and one thing only. And by that I mean like margin 10 pixels. Like that's the only thing that class does. And then just applying those to each specific component. So again, we kind of have to layer things on. So where the module in one place does one specific thing, we then start layering the layout stuff on top of those specific components. I'm not a huge fan of the micro layout approach, but recognize sort of the pros and cons. On the one side, if we try to create, if we wrap all modules with another element, then our HTML starts getting increasingly larger, whereas on the flip side, we may have style rules from the layout possibly conflicting with the layout styles of a particular module. Like if I have a button that's inline block, but then I suddenly throw a flex system on that, is it going to mess things up in a way that I didn't predict? So those are just considerations that we have to worry about either way. Hey, bonus problem. Media queries. Media queries consider the entire page. But again, when we're talking about the module, we're talking about one specific piece. And we care about the space that it has within its container. We don't care about the entire page. And therefore, from a media query's perspective, what we end up having to do is say, okay, in order for a media query to work, we need, let's say the module, when it's inside this module, which is inside this layout, which is inside a page or a viewport that is this big, do this. And so we actually have to know the combination of all the modules and layouts together in order to determine how our media query should work. Element queries or container queries actually solve that problem. I'll skip over that. So, ultimately what I want to say is if I have a certain amount of room, do this, right? And that's what element queries do. Which again, if you saw the presentation yesterday, you know that we don't have element queries in the browser yet. I'm just being a downer today, I'm sorry. There are like JavaScript polyfills, which is fantastic, but it does mean that you have to have JavaScript enabled in your project in order for that to work, which for some projects may. Like at Shopify, we did take an element query approach. We actually hand-rolled our own solution, and it was wonderful. I loved the ability to declare things, and so we didn't have to worry about what's our phone breakpoint, what's our tablet breakpoint. We just said, when does this particular component break, and we can create a query for that specific element, and then we can resize based on that. And that created a much more dynamic system, easier to manage, easier to build. Okay, so from a dev perspective, I've talked about a bunch of stuff. Kind of want to talk about things from a design perspective as well. So I talked a little bit of, like we're trying to modularize things. And sometimes what we're trying to modularize isn't always clear. So for example, if I'm creating a component, I might say, okay, I've got a list of events. My event view is going to be a component. And then I might have a products list. My product list could be a component. I might have a customers list. My customers list is a component. And yet the visual differences between them may be negligible, right? They're all list views. And so what we're trying to do is identify visual patterns. Now, if everything looked the same, it would be pretty boring, right? If all the text was the same size, all the text was the same font, if everything was just sort of the same color, you wouldn't be able to figure things out. It would take a long time to understand the context of where things are, and designers for years, centuries, have known that we need a way of differentiating items, right? And sometimes that's done with position, sometimes that's done with color, sometimes that's done with size, shape. These are all very useful tools for a designer. But we have to be a little bit careful that we don't create this mishmash where everything in the world is a special snowflake. I stole this slide off of Brad Frost. This was from a particular website, and this was all the different button styles that they had in their project. And that's a lot of unnecessary complexity. So print designers know this. Design has a cost. It doesn't seem like it for the web in the sense that, like, oh, I can make any change I want. I've got high-speed internet. This thing is wonderful. But design still has a cost in the web, just like it does in print, right? Like a print designer is not going to go, okay, I'm going to do the highest stock with 4-color output. I want spot colors, full bleed, and I want it to cost me $1 a sheet. Like, that's not going to happen. There are costs involved, and every piece of design ends up in code, and I think that needs to be clear. So as much as this particular page, you feel like, I need the button size to be 2 pixels bigger because it creates a great balance with all the inputs on this particular page, you do have to trade off that cost with, things like bandwidth. You have to consider performance. You have to consider just all these things in how complex our design should be. There's a cognitive overhead that people have to understand. If you've ever been on a site and thought, okay, I don't know exactly what this button is going to do. It seems different than all the rest. How should I interact with this thing? So trying to be consistent within our design can make things easier for users in a lot of ways. So we need to be able to identify and document those patterns, right? And again, when we think about what it is we're trying to identify, from a code perspective, it's an HTML element. We have this thing on our page that we're trying to style. It might be a div, might be a link, might be a button, but it's a thing, this HTML element. And we need a way of differentiating this one HTML element from all the others on the page. And so we do that with a selector. Now, in sort of the world of SMACs, one of the things that I noticed was that anytime I wrote a selector, it had a certain purpose. And so I wanted a way of being able to categorize what those purposes are. Now, as a result of that categorization, I can identify patterns, right? Pattern recognition is a good thing, and sometimes we need to bundle things together to be able to see those patterns. If you just look at one page and there's only one button on that page, and then you go to the next page and there's only one button on that page, and then you go to the next one, you might not notice the subtle differences between all those buttons, but if you suddenly take all those buttons out of context and put them together, you might think, okay, why do I have 5 different sizes? So that allows us to recognize those things. So I noticed 5 different categories. We have base styles, which are just like your CSS resets or your normalize, that's cool. We have layouts, so this is like the outer shell of the page. or a grid system where we're not really concerned about the content. We're just trying to create containers to put our content into. And then we have modules. Modules are the actual content. And then themes. Now, when I talk about themes, I'm talking about user initiated changes that need to be reflected instantly. So for like 95% of the projects that I've worked on, theming has been completely unnecessary, but sometimes it comes in. So theming is not just like, oh, I have a border color on something. You know, if all border colors should always be the same on your project and users don't have any ability to modify that, that to me is not considered a theming thing. That's just part of what a module looks like, or maybe part of what a layout looks like. And then on top of that, we have states. And states essentially take a thing, this object, this component, and then changes the look and feel of that particular thing. And so you can have layouts that change, like let's say you had a 2-column layout and then I click on a button and then the sidebar collapses, right? That's a layout change. If I have a button and I click on the button and it turns into an active state, that is a state change. So Yahoo Mail was one of the projects that I worked on. Has a header, has a sidebar, has content, right? So those are our layout containers. And then we just describe that. So layout header, using a naming convention that allows us to identify what these things are. Same thing with the modules. We just want to identify the individual pieces in our design. So whether they're tabs, buttons, list views, things like that. You know, if we have variations, so if we have something that looks slightly different, we have the core thing, the button, and then we're going to declare the variations, in this case, button dark. And then sometimes we have components that are a little bit more complex. They're not just a single HTML element. In the case of a modal dialog, for example, we have a header, we have a body, we have a footer, and we want to be able to associate those other HTML elements with that root HTML element. We want to say that all these things are associated together. And again, we can use a naming convention to associate that stuff. So when it comes to naming conventions, there's a ton of different ways to look at it. From a conceptual perspective, to me, when I look at like SMAX versus BEM versus like maybe a SAS approach, or you're into React, everything that I've seen have essentially fallen into the same model. So in the case of SMAX, and I say SMAX-C because this is slightly different than what I describe in the book, we have buttons, and then we have button variations, and then we have button components, so those child elements. And you know, just using like a hyphenation to separate those things, which if you've seen BEM, probably looks pretty familiar, right? Again, we have our HTML element, we have the variations on that element, and then we have the child elements, or the components of that particular element. Now, you know, typing out button is kind of complicated. So maybe I want to use SAS to kind of shortcut that. I can nest, and when I'm nesting, then I can do ampersand, variation, ampersand component. From one of the React examples, if you're into CSS modules, you know, I can have a button CSS that has a variation and component in there, and when it imports the button CSS, it will actually generate a new CSS class for you called button component, and then we'll add like a little hash to it to uniquely identify this thing for that component. So it kind of does the CSS generation for you, but it's still essentially doing the same thing, right? We're still isolating the CSS to a specific set of HTML that we want to style. All right? So we are trying to isolate this thing from everything else on the page. Now, sometimes we have a situation where we have something in a given context. Right? I have buttons in a modal dialog that I want to look a certain way. And this kind of selector is pretty easy to write. We know it's going to, you know, the specificity is probably going to be higher, so we know it's probably going to win out over the default styles. And yet, what we're trying to do is actually identify what kind of button this is. And one thing that I've noticed with growing projects is that once you have established something into existence, like you've brought this into the world, you're going to find other designers on the team, or maybe yourself in the future, where you say, you know what, that is fantastic. That will solve my problem in this other use case. But if I do something like modal child selector button, well, how do I move that into another context? I can't do it easily. I either have to increase my selectors or I have to change things around. And I still get this wrong. When I first built the SMAX website, on my workshop page, I had a list of locations. And the naming convention that I used was actually location. Right? That made sense to me to call these things location. But that was very sort of context specific. And when I ended up creating a products page, I'm like, oh, I love the way these locations are highlighted. It had like a nice blue background. So I ended up using, I wanted to use the same class. And being the lazy developer that I am, I just used my location class on product, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Like, I should have named something a little bit more contextual to the design role that it was solving. So if I do have a button in a modal, for example, why don't I come up with a name that is very specific to what that button is trying to do? In this case, maybe it's a slim button. And it's a slim button because I don't have as much space. So just coming up with a different naming convention to manage the kind of project that we're doing. And so, you know, as a result of this, we end up creating components. We create separate files. Or even if you're just doing this in one huge CSS file, all right, we're going to separate and keep everything separated, and that kind of separation is fantastic. And if we do the same thing for our HTML, so if you're using like mustache templating, or if you're into handlebars, or if you're into HTML bars, or if you're into Hogan or JSX, whatever sort of templating language you want to use, you know, we're associating that HTML with the CSS that we want to style that with. So very straightforward, right? This templating allows us to essentially create this ability to kind of stamp this thing over and over again. The system that we had at Yahoo essentially worked like this. We started off with the mustache template. We would compile in localization strings. We would bring in JSON mock data, and then we'd compile that into HTML. And then based on naming convention, we would associate CSS and JavaScript with that. So when we loaded the modal template, we would load the modal CSS and the modal JavaScript along with it. And that allowed us to test things on a per component basis. Because if you just build stuff together, and you know, how do you test an entire project of pages? If you make a CSS change, you end up having to go to every single page and hope nothing broke. Even if you use automated testing, you have to test every single state on every single page and see what broke. And those kinds of situations are really complex, really difficult to manage. So, you know, React components are a great way of this sort of componentization. I like the way React encourages component development. So, you know, if I want sort of a complex video component, I can create this component and it can render that out for me. But behind the scenes, it may have a much more complex HTML structure behind it. And it's the same thing with web components, right? With web components, I can create a custom element, but behind the scenes, it may have a much more complex association with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'm going to read this out to you because it's a lot to read. Keep in mind that I'm self-taught, so my code may be a little messy. So she comes over. Let me see. I'm sure that's fine. Wow. It's like being in a house built by a child using nothing but a hatchet and a picture of a house. It's like a salad recipe written by a corporate lawyer using a phone autocorrect that only knew Excel formulas. It's like someone took a transcript of a couple arguing at IKEA and made random edits until it compiled without errors. To which he finally says, okay, I'll read a style guide. But of course, XKCD is never without its alt text. I honestly didn't think you could even use emoji in variable names or that there were so many different crying ones. Yeah, that actually works, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so you know, we've written all this wonderful CSS, these templates, we've associated all this stuff, but how do we maintain that consistency in our projects? It is important to create standards for your CSS. There have been so many teams that I have come in where if you said, okay, your backend code, your Ruby developers, your PHP, your Java, can I commit code without a code review? Hell no, right? Everything gets reviewed, possibly by 2, 3 different people. Okay, what about your JavaScript? Nope, everything needs to be code reviewed. Everything before it goes live. What about your CSS? Oh, nobody cares about CSS. I can make a change and merge it without anything. It was like that at Yahoo. It was like that when I first got to Shopify. And that is how things get out of control. So establishing standards for your team, there's a lot of tools that you can use, linting tools, to help maintain that consistency within your project. So code review your CSS. I feel like if nothing else, if you do nothing else from this talk or from this conference, just go back and start doing code reviews for your CSS if you're not already. Now, a great resource is styleguides.io. There is a podcast. There is links to style guide generators, links to other people's style guides or pattern labs. It's a fantastic resource, and I highly recommend you check it out. So, as a result of, sort of building a style guide, of documenting this thing that we're trying to create, hopefully we can avoid the sort of mess of all these special snowflakes, and we can build a system that all fits together really nicely. Patterns should create a conversation around what exceptions should or should not exist, and should create a conversation around what components should or should not exist. So, we don't want a pattern library to essentially say, this is going to be the design for now and for always. New problems arise. We need to evolve the library. Again, Gina's talk yesterday was really good. And how do you create a team around that approach? And likewise, for the teams that I work on, we've also created a centralized team for creating the pattern library, but really reaching out to all teams, all designers, all developers to be able to push stuff back into that pattern library so we continue that evolution of great design. So, sort of to conclude things, we're trying to move towards composable UIs. So what I would call the Tetris interface, where we want these things to be able to fit in nicely together. And we want to ensure that the modules that we do create are self-contained, that they're independent, that they don't have all these dependencies to everything else on your page based on context or the things that they're beside. And thankfully, when we look at things like web components, we look at things like React and other frameworks, this tooling is getting better in helping us manage this sort of component-based future. And of course, most important of all is communicate. Talk to your team, talk to your clients. Communication is one of the key things about the work that we do. Unfortunately, I can't just go into a hole, code some brilliant stuff and throw it out into the world and just hope it magically solves everybody's problems. I need to be able to talk to the stakeholders to make sure that I am solving the right problems properly. So on that, thank you very much.